in Cooperstown for the Hall of Fame ceremonies. The day before the ceremonies, sports writers were interviewing all of us, and they kept wanting me to tell more and more stories about playing with Jackie. And I finally said to them, hey, you fellas know the Jackie stories better than I do by now. I got some notice from you, and I appreciate it, but just don't make me out to be a hero. It took no courage to do what I did. Jackie had the courage. What he had to go through, criticism, catcalls, loneliness, isolation, death threats, all that to try to hit a ball coming at you almost 100 miles an hour. I couldn't have done it. I don't know of anyone other ball player who could have. And I said to him also, you know, I remember late in Jackie's, right before he died, we were talking, I said, Jackie, you know, when you first came to the Dodgers, I didn't go out of my way to be nice to you. He said, I know, Pee Wee, that's one of the reasons I liked you. Jackie Robinson was a fine ball player, a great ball player. He became my friend. Jackie could help us win. I wanted to win. I wanted him on our team. That's pretty much it. The next day, at the Hall of Fame ceremonies, came my time to stand up and say a few words. I was scared to death standing up in front of that huge crowd of great ball players. I couldn't even let myself look at them. I did look down in that moment and I saw Dottie. And my mind flashed back to the very first time I'd ever seen her. She was at her house in Louisville, Kentucky, sitting out in the backyard, drying her hair in the sun. And I happened to be walking around the neighborhood. My sister lived right nearby. Dottie came over to the fence and introduced herself. And I was just tongue-tied. I just thought she was the prettiest girl I had ever seen. Well, I couldn't tell you exactly what I did say when I got up to the microphone, but I know I got a little too emotional at the end when I said if there was a Hall of Fame for wives, then Dottie would be there. In all the years I played baseball, I wore number 1 on the back of my uniform, but she was always number 1 in my heart. Thank you very much. I appreciate so much your kind attention. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Usher. Pee Wee Reese is one of my boyhood heroes, and thank you for bringing him back to life. It was great. Welcome. My name is Michael Embry. I used to be a sports writer. I still write some sports, and I covered baseball for with the Milwaukee Brewers back in the 80s and some things like that. Covered some all-star games, and I got to know Happy Chandler during my time as a sports writer. I'd like to introduce our panel. First, we have Chris Lamb. He's a former newspaper man. He's a professor of journalism at Indiana University, Indianapolis. And he's the author of 2 books. One, Blackout, and the second, Conspiracy of Silence, Sports Writers and the Long Journey to Desegregation of Baseball. Welcome, Chris. We have Ben Chandler, former congressman, State Attorney General, and he's now the Executive Director of the Kentucky Humanities Council. And as we all know, he's the grandson of A.B. Happy Chandler, the former baseball commissioner. And welcome. And we have Bill Marshall. He's the retired Director of Special Collections at the University of Kentucky. and he's written the book, Baseball's Pivotal Era from 1947 to 1956, right?
45.
45, okay.
To 51.
Sorry, okay. Okay, we're going to open up with Chris Lamb. He's going to discuss the time leading up to Jackie Robinson playing in baseball.
You got it. I might just stand up. Is that okay? I might stand here. As I was listening, to Pee Wee Reese, and you and I were probably thinking about a lot of the same things, but I bet you weren't thinking, I got to follow that guy. So the integration of baseball had everything to do with Branch Rickey and Jackie Robinson. It also had nothing to do with Branch Rickey and Jackie Robinson. The version that we get is the one that was narrated by Branch Rickey in the hours, days, weeks, months, and years after he signed Jackie Robinson, after the Brooklyn Dodgers announced that it signed Robinson in October of 1945. A year and a half later, Robinson played his first game for the Dodgers in April 1947. The signing of Robinson, it was not an isolated act. It wasn't restricted to two men. It was part of a larger narrative about the campaign for racial equality in this country that put into place what would become the civil rights movement. It was part of a direct challenge to the American way of life that happened after World War II, where white and black soldiers went off to die. And they died together on foreign battlefields. And after the war, black veterans came home and demanded equal rights, insisting that they had risked their lives to fight racism abroad and therefore were guaranteed or should have free rights, equal rights when they came home. They said they were prepared to die in America for equal rights. A lot of white Americans disagreed, and many of those black war veterans came home and were lynched or beaten, jailed, shot in their Army uniforms. Jackie Robinson was court-martialed in the Army in 1944 for confronting segregation while at an Army base in Fort Hood, Texas. He was facing trial. He was facing his court-martial when his Army unit was deployed to Europe. Because he challenged Jim Crow in the Army, he was available when Branch Rickey was looking for someone to integrate baseball, to challenge baseball, looking for the right person to confront baseball. Robinson was exonerated of all charges and was discharged. 3 days after his discharge, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the commissioner of baseball for the last 20-some-odd years, died. He was known as derisively as the Great White Father by the black press, because for his intractable opposition to removing the color line, to allowing blacks in baseball. Baseball owners the following spring selected as Landis's successor U.S. Senator A.B. Happy Chandler, the former governor of the segregated state of Kentucky. Major League Baseball owners felt sure baseball would remain segregated. Larry McPhail, the one-time owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers and then the owner of the New York Yankees, and Tom Spink, the editor of the Sporting News, wrote Chandler. They wrote Chandler. And they said they were outside pressures who wanted to desegregate baseball. They told Chandler that he needed to stand firm against these no-good do-gooders who wanted blacks in baseball. Baseball owners thought they had little to worry about. Happy Chandler, the former governor of a segregated state, was their kind of guy, they thought. But black newspapers had been campaigning for the integration of baseball for 14 years. They expressed their open disdain for Happy Chandler. But those black newspapers were happily surprised when a black journalist interviewed Happy Chandler. And Happy Chandler said he would end discrimination in baseball. "I do not believe in barring blacks from baseball because they are black," Chandler said. Wouldn't you have loved to see the face of those white team owners when they read that in the newspapers? The signing of Robinson was part of a decade-long struggle by black and communist journalists who had demanded the inclusion of blacks ball players into the big leagues. These black sports writers had knocked on the doors of major league owners and executives until their knuckles bled trying to get in. They had demanded tryouts for black players. They had sent petitions with 1 million names to Kennesaw Mountain Landis demanding that blacks be signed, and Landis threw them all away. If pressured about the color line, Landis would deny that there was such a color line. Black journalists were motivated by their own personal reasons. One of them was Wendell Smith, a black sports writer for the Pittsburgh Courier. When he was 17 years old, he was pitching for his American Legion team in Michigan. He was the only black on his team, the only black in his high school. He pitched his team to the state title. They won 1-0. After the game, the scouts came onto the field to sign these players, and they signed Smith's catcher, who ended up playing in the major leagues. They signed the losing pitcher, and he's waiting there saying, "Hey, what about me?" They told him he couldn't. He was the wrong color. And he went home that day and sobbed. 17-year-old boy. He had planned to be a baseball player. Instead, he said he would be a journalist, and he would change it, and he did. The color line was perpetuated by white mainstream sports writers who participated in a conspiracy of silence on the issue of the color line, saying little or nothing about the color line in their newspapers. If they said anything, they repeated the line from the baseball establishment that said the color line was in the best interest of white and black baseball. In 1942, the Pittsburgh Pirates, the worst team in baseball, their owner, who was playing in a city where black baseball thrived, he agreed to a tryout for 4 black players. And then he reneged on the tryout. The Sporting News responded to the possibility of a tryout of black players by saying there was no good in raising the race issue. The Sporting News said there were no blacks good enough to play in the white leagues. Blacks did not want to play with whites, that whites would not patronize ballparks if baseball became integrated, that there would be race riots if blacks and whites played together, and integration would destroy the Negro Leagues. Well, they were right about the last thing. They were wrong about everything else. During the spring of 1945, Wendell Smith and a Boston city councilman got together and forced the Red Sox to have a tryout. They basically told the Red Sox on this day, every year major league teams had to renew Sunday baseball before the city council. And the councilman said, "I'm not going to approve it." So he had him. So he had the team. Well, the Red Sox owner was a fellow named Tom Yawkey, and the Red Sox would become the last team to sign blacks. He was a racist from South Carolina. Well, they had to agree to try out to these 3 players. It's the spring, April 1945, and one of the players is Jackie Robinson. The Red Sox closed the tryouts to the press. They closed it to the public. They had high school pitchers pitch to these 3 black players. During one point, an executive with the Boston Red Sox stood up and said, "Get that word off the field," in a loud voice. This tryout coincided with a tryout with the Brooklyn Dodgers, where a black sports writer showed up with 2 aging black stars and demanded a tryout. Branch Rickey didn't like it, but he went along with it, and he gave these players who were long past their primes, he gave them a legitimate tryout. But Rickey first began thinking about breaking baseball's color barrier when he became the Dodgers president in 1943. During the spring of 1945, shortly after allowing the tryout of 2 players, he announced that he was going to have a team in the Negro Leagues. Announced he was going to have a team in the Negro Leagues, and it didn't make any sense. But there was a reason why Rickey did it. It was a smokescreen. This way, he could go around and scout black players without drawing attention to himself. Rickey understood that baseball would not become integrated as long as Landis was living. Landis's death removed that. During spring '45, something happened that also helped Rickey realize his hope. The New York legislature passed the Quinn Ives Act, in early 1945, which banned racial discrimination in hiring. The law would go into effect in July. When this happened, Ricky turned to his wife and said, "They can't stop me now." Ricky was not alone. He wasn't the only one who saw integration of baseball on a broader canvas. The signing of Robinson also had to do with the changing attitudes of racial relations in post-war America, but it also had a lot to do with the growing influence of political progressives in the state of New York. These progressives understood the irony that America had sent tens of thousands of black men to fight against racism in Europe, but that these men returned home to face racial discrimination. The United States Communist Party, for instance, recognized that blacks were among the most discriminated people in America. Therefore, we can recruit them. It's a recruiting tool. Now, if we can do something to get the blacks come and see our politics, and they saw baseball as a way of doing that. The Daily Worker, a communist daily published in Greenwich Village, New York, made integration of baseball one of its biggest issues. The newspaper published hundreds of columns and articles calling for the integration of baseball. This was more articles than all of white newspapers published combined. It was more articles than all of black newspapers combined. It was probably more articles than all of white and black newspapers combined, all coming from the Daily Worker. But it also hurt the cause as well, because the integration of baseball began seen as a communist front. Dozens of influential progressive politicians, actors, writers, and journalists belonged to the Committee to End Jim Crow in Baseball, which was based in New York City. New York politicians introduced resolutions to end segregation in baseball. In the U.S. Congress, the New York Senate, the New York Legislature, New York City Council, New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia created a committee of influential New Yorkers for his own committee, the Mayor's Committee on Baseball. The committee included Ricky, who did not reveal his plans to LaGuardia. LaGuardia met with owners of the other two major league teams, Larry McPhail of the Yankees, Horace Stoneham of the Giants, and LaGuardia told them about what he wanted. He wanted these New York teams to sign black baseball players. McPhail and Stoneham told him to mind his own business. Ricky continued to meet. In late August, Ricky called Robinson into his office, and that was their first meeting. And Ricky was trying to find how tough Robinson was. And that's where Robin said, "Do you want someone who's not tough enough to fight back?" And of course, Ricky said, "I want somebody who's tough enough, who doesn't fight back, who's quiet, who can take everything." In October, LaGuardia told Ricky he had intended to deliver his weekly press conference on the progress of his committee. But Ricky asked LaGuardia to delay his talk. He did not want LaGuardia to go first, because then Ricky thought it would sound like he was being pressured to do this. So LaGuardia delayed his talk, and Ricky then announced that he had signed Jackie Robinson, October 23rd, 1945. The announcement changed not just baseball, but society. Martin Luther King would later say of Jackie Robinson that he was a freedom rider before freedom rides, a sit-inner before sit-ins. He would later say of Robinson that that Robinson made Martin Luther King's journey easier. We do an injustice if we restrict the integration of baseball to sports. One cannot tell the story of the civil rights movement without telling the story about Jackie Robinson and the integration of baseball. Integration of baseball was the most important story about civil rights in the years immediately following World War II. And we do an injustice to history if we restrict the story to Robinson and Ricky, who deserve our praise and undying admiration. But the story includes many others. We need to include black sports writers. We need to include communist sports writers and progressive politicians. And we need to include Happy Chandler and Pee Wee Reese. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And now we'll go to Ben Chandler and his recollections.
Thank you. That was very good, Chris. I hate to follow. I feel like I'm out of place in this group because, of course, we got Pee Wee over here who knew about it personally, And then we got these two who are scholars on the subject. And they have done research and they know it inside and out. And what I bring to the table, I guess, is I grew up across the street from my grandfather and had him for 32 years. I knew him well. I spent an enormous amount of time with him. And I heard, growing up, a lot of these stories. I heard a lot of them. I saw the struggle that he had in many respects to, I guess, be recognized for some credit where this was concerned. But I think Chris laid it out very, very well, that it was a big deal in our society, in the history of our country, and really in some ways in the history of race relations worldwide. But there were a lot of forces at play, a lot of forces on both sides of the issue. And it was a very, very difficult issue, and you've got to understand it in its context. We still in America were basically living in a separate but equal world. And that brings us back to Kentucky also. We had in the 1890s, there was a decision, famous decision called Plessy versus Ferguson. And it set the parameters for segregation in our country. It basically defined segregation. You could segregate if you had institutions that were separate but equal. Well, of course, we had a guy, John Marshall Harlan, Justice John Marshall Harlan from Kentucky, who was at the time on the U.S. Supreme Court, and he dissented from that position, saying, among other things, that it was just not workable in a fair and equal society, and that you could never have separate but equal. And of course, I think history has proved him to be very farsighted and correct and courageous in his point of view. But in the 1940s, we were still living in that separate but equal world. And people had a real hard time dealing with desegregation. Very difficult time dealing with it. When my grandfather was elected as commissioner of baseball, it really was one of the immediate things that he was confronted with. What are you going to do? Because this was boiling. This issue was boiling. And as I think Chris pointed out very, very well, you had sports writers pushing it, you had politicians pushing it, and then you had an enormous amount of resistance on the other side. And he came into baseball from a desegregated state. He, in fact, grew up in an area of the state that was sort of the cradle of the Confederate part of Kentucky, the western part of the state. And in fact, later in his career, 10 years later, he was governor again and was called on to desegregate the schools in Kentucky. And resistance came in two towns in Kentucky, in western Kentucky. One was Sturgis, Kentucky. The other was Clay, Kentucky. And he ended up calling out the National Guard for the purpose of making sure that the black kids were able to go to school. Just the opposite of what George Wallace and Orville Faubus and some of the other governors at the time did. Just so happened that Clay and Sturgis were right down in the area where he grew up. That was actually where he was from. So the people that he grew up around were the people who were really providing most of the resistance. Those people and people like those people throughout the country. So it was a very, very difficult position to be in. But it's very true. He always told me, he said, Commissioner Landis just wouldn't let him play. He wasn't about to let him play, and as long as he was commissioner, it wasn't going to happen. And so it proved. It did not happen under Commissioner Landis. When he got in, and I think Chris mentioned it, the reporters, some from I think an African-American publication or two, asked him what he was going to do, and he said, you don't have to worry about me. I'm not going to stand in the way of desegregation. You will see when the time comes. The time came pretty soon, and the commissioner at the time was a little bit, he was the second commissioner. Landis was the first commissioner they ever had. The only reason that the owners got him as a commissioner was they were afraid that if they didn't get somebody in there as commissioner, the game could not survive because it was on the heels of the Black Sox scandal of 1919, and they had to have some integrity brought to the game. Well, when he died, they had chafed under his rule, and they wanted a fella who would do what they told him to do. And in that respect, they were disappointed in my grandfather. He did not do what they wanted him to do. I think Tom Yawkey, who Chris also mentioned, the owner of the Red Sox, was quoted, and Bill, you know this quote, and I may not get it right, but I'm going to try. Tom Yawkey, the owner of the Red Sox, said, "We've got a commissioner now who's the players' commissioner, the fans' commissioner, the umpires' commissioner, everybody's commissioner but the people who pay him." Was that close?
Very good.
And he saw it in a broader sense, that he was not just the commissioner for the owners, and of course that caused him some difficulty. But he had been in the United States Senate during the war, and I think a lot of the pressure was caused by black soldiers fighting for their country, and as my grandfather said, dying for their country. And how could I possibly stand in the way of a group of people who fought and died for their country? Now I'm supposed to tell them they can't play the national pastime? And then he followed with his famous quote, and that was that someday I'm going to have to meet my maker. And when I do, and he asked me why I didn't let this boy, and that's of course not a word that you would want to use in that setting today. It's not politically correct, but I think it might have been a little bit more when he first said it. In any event, if I didn't let this boy play because of the color of his skin, that might not be a sufficient answer. So he felt, I think, very strongly, and the commissioner was something of a traffic cop. He had the ability to put up a red light or a green light. And no matter what you say about the details of the thing and how much somebody did or didn't do, Landis put up a red light, and my grandfather put up a green light. Just that simple. And there's no evidence